Welcome to Rotoviz Radio. You are listening to episode 43. My name is John Moore, and with me is Matt Friedman. Matt, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Not stuck in the Seattle airport, so that's a positive. But I'm very excited to be back on the show. It's the number 43 episode, the Troy Polamalu episode. That's a big guy for a big show. Right now, I actually want to thank PA Mike 81. He left an iTunes review for us in this last week. If you like the podcast, please let us know on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. You can leave a rating and a review. Let us know that we are definitely not the worst podcast ever. I also want to thank the previous guests from last week, Shane P. Hollom and Pete Damalatis, and also want to thank guest co-host Davis Maddock, who filled in for me. It was a great show last week and a great show coming up this week.
Yes, in this week's episode, up first, we have Doug Veatch from UTH Dynasty to talk about the 2015 NFL Draft, rookies, and some philosophy on Dynasty Fantasy Football. And then following that, we'll have Jim McCormick from ESPN.com to talk conference championships, and we'll look ahead to the Super Bowl. It's a great episode, but first, let's reflect on the week that was in football. Matt, something that I want to just talk about real quick as far as the championship games. In the AFC, watching the Colts-Patriots, obviously it was a beat down. I couldn't help but think that the Patriots just have so many more niche, excellent players who are just like really good at, quote, doing their job, as the Patriots kind of preach. And just when you have so many contingencies to have to plan against, whether it's, Gronkowski or Vereen out of the backfield or Blunt hammering down the middle, or there's so much to account for. How do you stop them when they get on that kind of a roll? And comparatively, the Colts looked, I don't want to say shallow, but they just, the Belichick way, going back to have his dad's book, like Scouting Football or whatever it's called, like what he grew up on, Belichick, was stop the opponent's best option and then make them beat you with their plan B. And they wiped T.Y. Hilton out, and it was just like, what is their plan B? Like a beat up, aging Hakeem Nicks, like Reggie Wayne, who's like 37 or 38 years old at this point, like Kobe Fleener, like what are they going to beat you with? It's not T.Y. Hilton. So that's kind of my take on the AFC Championship game.
Yeah, even though it was a blowout, I thought it was actually still a really fun game to watch. Yeah. The Seattle-Green Bay game, I mean, what do you say about that? I thought it was a total coaching meltdown on the part of Green Bay, and I think Seattle got really lucky. I mean, to be able to win a game in which your quarterback throws 4 interceptions. Actually, so for Russell Wilson to win that game was actually very, I'd say, like Romo-esque, given that he threw as many interceptions as he did. You'd think that like after the 3rd interception, you just wouldn't throw back to Jermaine Kearse again. But I guess lucky for him that he did, because Kearse actually, ended up with the game-winning touchdown. But that was just such a crazy game. And in the end, I remember thinking that maybe the 2 most important guys for Seattle after that game were Steve Hauschka and John Ryan, the kicker and the punter, because the punter threw the touchdown that got them back in the game, and Hauschka had the onside kick that ended up being successfully recovered. Like without those 2 plays, Seattle is just, watching this next Super Bowl. So I thought that was a pretty incredible game, and amazing how much of it came down to 2 key special teams plays.
Mm-hmm. And if you check out the MMQB articles that recapped both of the games, they had a long section talking about all the special teams contingency planning that the Seahawks do, and in particular, I can't remember the linebacker, maybe Brad Collins. I don't know if that's a player, if I'm making him up, but the special teams coach had noticed that he was crashing hard repeatedly without any respect for the threat of a pass on like a fake. And so they basically came out of the play, and whichever side Collins was on, assuming he was on the field, they were going to throw to the eligible receiver on that side because they knew Collins would leave him alone. And so basically that's exactly what happened. He lined up to the left of the offense, and the backup offensive tackle slipped out, and bingo, bango, bongo, Seahawks back in it. Just kind of a funny anecdote. You talk about being at airports. So I actually watched the fourth quarter and the overtime of that game from like an airport restaurant. And if you remember, when the Seahawks took the lead at 20-19, they went for 2 to try to get up by 3 points. And Russell Wilson scrambled over to the right, kind of looked over his shoulder, saw he had some backside pursuit, and then basically lobbed it like cross field to the corner of the end zone to Luke Wilson. And it was like double coverage, and just sort of, watching it just instinctively, I said, oh my God, imagine if that got picked off and run back for 2 points for the Packers to go up 21-20. And this little like 5'3" pilot sitting next to me just turns over his shoulder and like snarkily says, yeah, that would be funny, except that can't happen because that can't happen in the NFL. And then just turns around and like starts watching the TV again. And I was just like, if I ever wanted to get in a fight in the airport about NFL rules, like that was it right there.
That's great. Yeah, and you actually really have to wonder what on earth was HaHa doing on that play. Like, the replay of that, it's like he had a clear shot at hitting the ball, and some reason he sort of like half lunged at Wilson and half lunged at the air. It was really pretty incredible.
Lunged at the air.
Yeah.
What a description. Well, with that, let's get into this episode. As I mentioned, up first, we've got Doug Veatch from UTH Dynasty to talk rookies for the 2015 NFL Draft and some Dynasty fantasy football philosophy. It's a really fun segment. In the middle, Matt and I are going to dig in actually to a rookie draft that we did recently and share some takes on that very early, but we had a lot of fun with that. And then closing the show will be Jim McCormick from ESPN.com talking about the AFC and NFC title games, and then we'll look ahead to the Super Bowl. Let's get to it. Welcome to the show, Doug Veatch, who you can find on Twitter at Harada2. He's the co-owner of UTH Dynasty and co-host of the UTH podcast, as well as a Dynasty fantasy football philosopher. Doug, how are you?
I'm doing well. I appreciate you guys having me on tonight. It's an honor to come on your show, and I'm looking forward to talking some Dynasty with you guys. Absolutely,
and Matt and I are big Dynasty junkies, so we appreciate what you and Chad have going on over there. So up first, Conference Championship weekend, what caught your eye? And then are there any Dynasty implications that you took note of?
Well, really what caught my eye was the lack of wide receivers for Seattle. And moving on towards the Super Bowl, I really think that Seattle's going to have a tough time matching up with New England because, well, Revis and Brown to me, they can take Baldwin and Kearse out of the game pretty much. So if it's me and I'm sitting there game planning, I'm probably going to double spy Russell Wilson, and I'm going to stack 8 in the box, and I'm going to dare them to beat me on the outside. The only guy you have to really worry about running free at all is Luke Wilson. But I think that they can do a really good job managing him as well. So I think that the Super Bowl is going to be a little bit lopsided. I know a lot of people said that last year when Seattle completely spanked Denver, but that's just my opinion. But Seattle really needs some wide receivers, man. They really desperately need them. And even if it was a guy that only got like 120 targets or 100 targets every year, he's still going to have a lot of dynasty value because everyone is going to probably overdraft that guy.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that you mentioned that because Davis Maddock, his sort of hot take last week to intro the show, he was filling in for Matt, was I wonder at what point Seattle's receivers come back to hurt them when there's just not enough ammo there to really get defenses off of Lynch and Wilson. So interesting point to hear that coming from a second person in 2 weeks. But I guess transitioning into some of the questions. For UTH Dynasty, you write a regular column called Weekly Dynasty Challenge that kind of serves as an ongoing check-in for Dynasty GMs. To that point, can you kind of share some of your thoughts on important steps Dynasty players can be taking right now to set themselves up for success in 2015?
Well, I think the first thing that a dynasty player should do as soon as the season's over is they should do an objective roster evaluation. And what I mean by that is kind of taking off the rosy colored glasses and looking at your team as if it wasn't your team. Like if you're on a forum board and someone posted this team, how would you tear it apart? Do that exactly the way you would for them for your own team. Other than that, knowing your contract situations for every single player on your team. You'd be surprised how many guys don't even know that Mark Ingram's a free agent or that DeMarco Murray's a free agent. Just things like that, just the little things, paying attention to details. I remember last year getting Golden Tate thrown in a ton of deals. I didn't know where he was going, but I knew he was a free agent, and I knew he was a guy that was kind of a little bit of a metric marvel in a sense, and that if he landed in the right spot, he could have a huge value for my dynasty team, which he ended up having a ton of value for me because he went to Detroit and he was a guy I was able to flip in season for a ton.
Doug, I really liked what you had to say there. And on my spreadsheets that I have for my different dynasty rosters, I have two columns. One of them has to do with when a guy's contract expires, and then the second column has to do with kind of when I could see, regardless of the contract situation, him being forced out of the team, or when his contract situation could change in some way. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really shrewd there. One concept that frequently comes up on your Twitter feed is #PackageUp. Can you explain what that means and why it's a key practice for effective dynasty building? And is there any ideal time of year in which people should be packaging up?
Well, dynasty fantasy football is 24/7, 365, so there is no bad time to start packaging up. And the whole premise really around packaging up is building your teams the right way so you can package up in the first place. So let's say that you stockpiled some wide receivers, and let's say that you get Martavis Bryant or something like that in the late second round last year of your rookie drafts. And let's say you had a really good year and you're sitting at 109 or something like that, but Martavis Bryant's your wide receiver 8. So what you do is you take that 109, you take Martavis Bryant, and you try to move up to get yourself another blue chips prospect, to get yourself into the top 4 so you can kind of get the remains of whoever leaves, let's say a Todd Gurley or a Amari Cooper or Melvin Gordon or a Devontae Parker or a Dorial Green Beckham on the board for you. So it's all about just constantly moving up and always trying to get a better piece, a better rookie pick or that blue chip prospect so that your dynasty outlook is that much better.
Definitely. I agree with that. I think one of the keys for me in Dynasty has been always trying to make those little trades where you can move up kind of 3 or 4 picks at a time, and eventually you have a pick in a higher round. What do you think are the biggest mistakes people make in managing their Dynasty rosters?
There are so many, man. I'll just name off a few that I thought of off the top of my head. 1, not knowing contract situations. 2, evaluating your roster with rosy-colored glasses on. I see a lot of people that deem players on their roster untouchable, like you can't trade me for them no matter what you offer me. Owners stay stagnant. They don't trade. They don't do research. Owners are afraid to click the accept button because they're afraid to lose deals. They don't respond to trade offers. Everyone seems to have this little imaginary world, and it's something I don't personally believe in because of the way I build dynasties, but I think 3-year windows are the biggest farce of dynasty fantasy football because if you're doing it right, your window is infinite. There's no such thing as a 3-year window. And then I also think that people make mistakes sitting on winning lottery tickets, even if they're just a $2 scratch off, like Justin Forsett or something like that. In a year where the running back was so light, Justin Forsett came in and had a really nice season, and you had a prime opportunity to either sell him individually or package him up, right? So he's not like the ultimate winning lottery ticket, like, say, an Odell Beckham Jr. or something like that, but I just consider him like a $2 scratch off. It's like, hey, I got my money back here, or I made a couple bucks, so why don't I try to go cashing him in? And then another one would be people not dropping their kickers and defenses in the offseason so they can take a couple shots on some flyer guys that they like.
Mm-hmm. Funny that you mentioned Justin Forsett in the league that I'm most active in. Week 13, week 14, I was trying to trade for him for the stretch run, and this guy that owned him was like, you need to give me a first-round pick for him. You need to give me a first-round pick for him. I'm like, look, dude, you got him for nothing. You could have totally made a profit here. I'm not going to give you that. I'll give you something. And, now who knows what Forsett's going to be next year, and he's just stuck with him. So, and he's one of the worst owners in the league, unsurprisingly. So we're talking with Doug Veatch, who you can find on Twitter at Harada2. So every year there are these star players who are leaving through free agency. They end up, being cut because of their cap number, etc. And young players get to step up and fill their shoes. Looking ahead to next season, who are some running backs that you think are poised for a much bigger role?
Well, I don't see a whole lot of running backs that are the landscape is just so thin right now. And I think it's going to be the rookie class that really comes in and gives dynasty owners that influx of talent that needed. But, some guys could be like a Bishop Sankey. I think that Mark Ingram is going to have a much bigger role. I think he will move on from New Orleans and we'll finally be able to see him in a lead back role. I think guys like Charles Sims could step up because of Doug Martin's inefficiencies over the last couple of years. And one guy that I'm super high on, I would love to see Latavius Murray just take the job and run with it. And the addition of Mike Tice there in Oakland is really going to help his chances.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. With this year's class being so deep at running back, to imagine any veteran guys really stepping up who aren't maybe just first or second year players. That's a good thought there. Matt, did you have a follow up?
Yeah, Doug, I was wondering, you had mentioned the possibility of Mark Ingram leaving, and I think that is very likely. Do you think it's possible that Kyrie Robinson could end up taking a larger hold of that New Orleans backfield?
I think that any running back that you stick there in New Orleans is going to be a pretty decent fantasy asset. I'm not the biggest Kyrie Robinson fan, and the same for Cadet, and really any running back that they've had over there over the last few years, not named Mark Ingram. I always thought that the guy was the best talent there. I just didn't understand why they were using him. Now, one thing I could see New Orleans doing, though, is using a top 100 pick on a running back in a class that is going to be just ridiculously deep like this. And if that does happen, then what you're going to have is a mucked up situation all over again. And it's just like it's a weekly dart throw, basically. And you don't want to get into the situation where you're holding like 4 New Orleans running backs on your dynasty roster and just praying to God that you have the right one. It's just really not the way you want to do it. So it's kind of one of those situations that I just tend to avoid unless there's one of those clear cut studs there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Transitioning to the wide receiver position, are there any young players who you've maybe stashed that you're optimistic about their upside this coming year, especially maybe considering that the rookie class doesn't look to be as deep at the wide receiver position?
Well, I think because of the injury or the season-ending injury that Brandon Cooks had, I think that he's a little undervalued right now, but I think that he's going to have a huge sophomore campaign. And there actually is a couple veterans too. Like I think Michael Crabtree has a really good chance to bounce back from being a San Francisco 49er for so long, because Kaepernick was just god awful this year. And I just believe that Crabtree's been used wrong for a very long time. He projects more as a slot receiver to me. He's got great hands, runs great routes, but once you get him past that 15 yards on his routes, he loses a lot of effectiveness. So like keep him in between 0 and 15 yards or whatever the case may be, and just feed the guy the ball. I think he's one of the best possession receivers in the game, but they're just completely using him wrong. So there's a couple that I was thinking about. And also Torrey Smith could gain some value as well if he were to go somewhere else. I just think that he needs to play opposite of someone that's more talented than him.
Yeah, I could see that. I think Torrey Smith would be a fantastic number 2 wide receiver who could have that kind of almost like back in the day when it was Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne could put up kind of like low end wide receiver 1 numbers. If Torrey Smith could get in a situation like that, I think he could be an excellent number 2 who can kind of provide that wide receiver 1 value on occasion. Turning our focus to the draft, can you talk a little bit about your process for evaluating players, what are the types of things you look for, and then is there a position that you think you are especially skilled at evaluating?
Well, I'm pretty old school when it comes to this kind of stuff. I don't do a whole lot of the metric side. That's kind of Chad's thing for Under the Helmet. But I watch a ton of film, and I kind of watch it over and over and over, and I just kind of look for little things that I notice throughout people's game that I either like or I do not like. As far as me being good at like one position or another. I've always been pretty good when it comes to evaluating quarterbacks and wide receivers. I've had some really nice hits over the years in my dynasty teams, especially like super flex leagues. Once you play in a super flex league, you start evaluating the quarterback position a little bit more harshly than maybe you would in just start one leagues. And I've hit on guys like Russell Wilson really late, and picked up like Mettenberger and Derek Carr in basically every super flex league I play in this offseason. So I'm pretty stacked at those positions. But one more thing I was going to say too is like, you got the film, you got the metrics when you're doing all these scouting, but when it comes down to being on the clock, and basically it all comes down to gut instinct, you know what I mean? Because you're probably going to have a couple players that fit your profile really well, but who's in the better situation, and who do you feel is going to be the better NFL player over the long run?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see that. For me, it's kind of unfortunate because my instincts are always wrong. I remember a couple of years ago, I had the 10th pick in a rookie draft, and I was really beating myself up over whether I should take Marcus Lattimore or Cordarrelle Patterson. And years later, both of those look like they would have been horrible. Talking about some of these upcoming rookies that we can expect to be drafted, do you have any sense right now as to kind of like your early draft season top 5 at the running back position?
Oh, absolutely. I've been doing this stuff since like November, so I've been all over it. My top 5 right now would be Todd Gurley, Melvin Gordon, Jay Ajayi, TJ Yeldon, and Tevin Coleman at this point. So that'll be my top 5. And I'm pretty sure that all 5 of those guys are probably going to go in the first round of basically every rookie draft to come rookie draft season.
Yeah, I like all those guys, especially Ajayi. One guy you didn't mention, Cobb from Minnesota. Can you tell us where he might fit in?
I think he's going to fit in outside of probably the top 10 for me. And that's not because I don't like him as a talent so much as that I think I'm just going to be able to get him later. You know what I mean? I think he's going to be one of those guys where I can get in like the 3rd or 4th round. And I like his upside, and I think he does some things well, but that's kind of like my cutoff point. Like, I'm not going to go reach into the late 2nd round to grab him, but I'll be happy to grab him like the mid 3rd, early 4th round. And I think that's where he's probably going to end up going, unless like some team really surprises us and drafts him highly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, just in one of the mock drafts that Scott Fish is organizing right now, I think I just got Cobb at like 4-3, something like that, which I was thrilled to get him there, but I was kind of surprised. But yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to weed out that tier after the 5 that you mentioned. That like Mike Davis is in there, Duke Johnson. It'll be really interesting to see how these guys work out, because as far as numbers wise, on-field production, it's hard to do too much deciphering. And so, yeah, it should just make the next couple weeks that much more exciting.
There was one other guy too that I wanted to touch on really quick, if you don't mind. Jeremy Langford from Michigan State. I think that he is a very, very excellent prospect, and I think that he's being overlooked right now by a ton of people, and even in mock drafts, like I'm consistently getting this guy in the 4th round. And I think a lot of people forget that he has contributed for the last 2 years at a very high level at Michigan State. In his first 2 years, he played behind Le'Veon Bell. So if you're going back and you're doing things like metrics, and maybe he didn't have that freshman season where he dominated, well, that's because he was playing behind Bell. And he's also a guy that can catch the ball pretty well out of the backfield and has a decent knack for pass protection. So I could see him being a 3-down back in the NFL. And I think a lot of people should do some film study on him, and I'm pretty sure you'll come away pretty impressed.
Wow, yeah, that is a good take on someone who doesn't get a lot of attention. Switching over to the wide receivers, can you run us through again your top 5 there?
Oh, absolutely. Mari Cooper, Devontae Parker, Kevin White, Dorial Green-Beckham, and then I'm still having a little bit of a toss-up issue. I can't decide if I like Jalen Strong or Devin Funchess better at this point, because I want to see Funchess come in the NFL as a tight end. I don't think he's going to be able to play receiver in the NFL. Hybrid tight end, I think he'd be all about that, and I think he'd thrive in that role. But I do think it'd take him a year or 2 to get acclimated to the position, because most tight ends usually take 2 to 3 years before they are fantasy worthy, unless your name's Rob Gronkowski.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so most of those guys are a little bit on the bigger side. Matt and I were just kind of having this conversation before we recorded about who are the guys in that sort of 6'1", 6'2", maybe 185 to 195 pound range that are going to emerge? And we were kind of debating between like a Titus Davis, Tyler Lockett, a Golar, Stephon Diggs. Who are some guys that you like that maybe are a little bit on the smaller side?
Man, I usually tend to shy away from those guys, to be honest with you. Like, I've watched some Stephon Diggs on tape, and I feel like another year in college would have done that guy so much good. But he decided to come out a year early, and I'm just really not impressed with his game. And then, like, Nelson Aguilar, like, USC wide receivers just scare the crap out of me. And they're all basically the same size when they come out of college. So it's just like this weird trend with them that they just keep pumping out the same product in the NFL, and people keep buying that product. And I don't get it. It's like if you go to the store and you buy a box of Wheaties and it has mold in it and you do it like 5 times in a row, you're going to keep buying Wheaties? No, you're going to give up on the Wheaties. Like, I like Wheaties. I used to like them, but I don't like them anymore. So I just really don't understand that mindset with people, because he's going to be probably an early second round pick. And here's my biggest thing with a wide receiver that's that size, right? It's like, and even a little bit smaller than the 6'1", because once you hit like 6'1", like 185, you have to be ridiculously athletic to make it. It's like you're either Deshaun Jackson or you're not, and he's even smaller than that. Mm-hmm. So if you're not Deshaun Jackson, then I'm just going to place my chips elsewhere, is basically what I'm saying here. I just don't like betting on those types of players.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because even going back to guys like Steve Smith of the New York Giants, Ronald Johnson, Robert Woods, Marquise Lee last year, it's it is kind of a line of those same build, and at least of the last three, like the Woods, Lee, and now a Golar trio. I think I almost maybe like Robert Woods the best of those guys, and it's I don't know, not nothing too sexy there, but yeah, for some reason people seem to be jazzed up on him a little bit. One last question, Doug. Tell us about uthdynasty.com. What can we expect to see in the coming months from the site, and what are the top resources someone who's maybe not familiar with the site would really enjoy?
Well, during this offseason, we're going to be doing a ton of player profiles. So most of the time you're going to be seeing multiple profiles on the same player. So we're probably going to be doing them now. And then once the combine hits, we'll be doing a player profile again. And then after they get drafted, we'll be doing another player profile, because let's face it, player value changes 3 times, because right now there's a certain value for a guy like TJ Yeldon. After the combine, his value is either going to go up or down. And then after the draft, it's either going to go up or down again. So you got to kind of stay on course and always know the value of these players, so you know where to draft them ultimately in your rookie draft. So it's really important to pay attention to that and do multiple profiles, because I think a lot of sites, they just kind of like put out one profile and hey, it's done. Things change. And as far as like what people can get out of UTH Dynasty, I think basically what we do there is we try to give actionable advice. It's not we're just saying, or we're writing up an article because a situation happened in the NFL and this is how it affects Dynasty. It's more like, hey, this is what you should be thinking about doing. This is how you need to improve your Dynasty teams. And one thing that I really think we can help players that are even veterans or newbies to Dynasty is I think that we can help you mold a title building philosophy. So that's what we're really going to get out of coming to uthdynasty.com if you guys ever want to come and check out the site.
Sounds great, and that's a fantastic model about the profiles over time, because definitely player values do evolve. Doug, thank you so much for your time. This was a lot of fun. Be sure to check him out over at uthdynasty.com, and we will catch you later.
Thanks for having me on, John. Matt, I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, this was great. And I was thinking, when you were talking about the USC wide receivers, sometimes like there are those big boxes of Wheaties that are still just as bad as the smaller ones, and it's like Dwayne Jarrett and like USC like big fat Mike Williams.
Yep.
Sometimes they have these huge wide receivers who also suck. Right. It's actually pretty amazing.
Patrick Turner.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Patrick Turner.
Right. They got the small boxes and the family size boxes that all suck.
Yeah.
All right. Good stuff. on the heels of that fun session with Doug Veatch, Matt and I wanted to take a few minutes to walk through a rookie mock draft that we are in with Doug. It is organized by Scott Fish of Dynasty League Football, and it's just kind of our first time getting into the rookie mock draft waters this year. So we had a few interesting insights to share, and Matt is going to kick us off.
Yeah, so I was picking from the 7th position. It was a 4-round draft. And when it got to me, obviously the top 4 guys were gone: Cooper, White, Gurley, and Parker. And then Melvin Gordon and Dorial Green-Beckham were also off the board. So at that point, my basic approach to the draft was that wide receivers selected after the 4th round of the NFL draft, they hardly ever pan out. So if I wanted a wide receiver with a decent chance of NFL success, I would have to grab one in the 1st round and then just kind of hope to be able to get a quarterback or some running backs later. And so it really came down to Jalen Strong versus Devin Funchess. And I really like Strong a lot. I think he's got pretty good size. He's had really strong production. Even going back to his junior college freshman year, he had good production. Funchess has had good market share, and he's got great size, but he's had really horrible raw production basically his whole career. So I'm really not a huge Funchess fan. For me, it was pretty easy to go with Jalen Strong there.
Yeah, and I made this statement the other day on Twitter to someone, and I don't wholeheartly know how I feel about this, but I'd be curious to get your input, Matt. I said Devin Funchess kind of reminds me of a guy like Stephen Hill in that he's big, he's going to probably test well, he's got great market share, good age, but there's just something kind of like unnerving about a guy whose max season receiving yards is like, I don't know exactly what it is, but like 700 or something like that, and a handful of touchdowns.
Yeah, that feels like that would be a great season for a guy coming in as a tight end.
Yeah. I don't know, but then it's are we overthinking it too? So there's lots of pixels still to be spilled about Devin Funchess.
Yeah, one quick thing to say really about Funchess, and getting to wide receivers in general. It has been a long time since we've seen a guy in the NFL have success who didn't have like at least 900 receiving yards in a season and at least like, 6, let's say like at least 8 touchdowns, right? Mm-hmm. And like Funchess has like never hit those numbers.
Right. Definitely a lot to debate there. Matt, I was a few picks behind you in the 10 hole. And so you went with Strong. Right after that was Funchess and TJ Yeldon. So I was at 10 and I was debating Jay Ajayi, Tevin Coleman, maybe Max Williams there at 10. Ultimately, I went with Ajayi, who was the 4th running back off the board at pick 10. What I like about him, I mean, the size is a plus. I think he's kind of 6 feet, 220 pounds. I loved that he declared for the NFL before his bowl game against Arizona, and then he still went out and just like rocked that game. There was no playing easy, none of that to try to protect himself or whatever you want to say. Another thing that I like about him is that he's got great receiving prowess. I think for this season, I mentioned this on the DLF podcast I was on last week. I think he's the only player since the year 2000 to have 1,700 rush and 500 receiving yards in a single season. So Jay Ajayi is definitely kind of an interesting package there, and I was happy to get him at pick 10. I think there's going to be a lot of value in kind of the 8 to 12, 8 to 14 range of this draft.
Yeah, I like that. I really like Ajayi too. I think he's a slightly lesser Matt Forte, but will basically fill that function in the NFL, and I think he will probably end up getting drafted in the 2nd round range, just like Forte did years ago. In the 2nd round at pick 2.7, so the 19th pick overall, I picked Jameis Winston. And, it's the kind of situation where I'm not thrilled with his regression in production this last year, and I'm not thrilled with all the off-the-field issues. But I think the value there was just too great to pass up because he's going to be a first-round quarterback, probably in the top 15 picks, if not higher. He's going to get a chance to start. He could potentially be looking at the teams that are picking kind of in the range where he might go. He could easily get on a team that has a pretty good wide receiver. But, I think at that position, considering that the wide receivers left on the board were guys like Sammy Coates, Stephon Diggs, Devin Smith. And although I did like some of the running backs available, like Javorius Allen and David Cobb, just the chance to get a potential franchise quarterback in the second half of the second round, that was just kind of too good to pass on. But I have to say, if Max Williams had been there, I 100% would have taken him without even looking at any other player. He was the guy I was really hoping would fall to that spot.
Yeah, and just to comment about Max Williams, because I'm in two of these drafts with Scott. In this draft that we're talking about, Max went at 14. In the other draft that I'm in, I took him at 15. And just to comment on that, like I basically think that he is probably, unless he runs like a 4.8 something, I think he's basically going to come out fairly similarly to like a Tyler Eifert or an Eric Ebron in my models. And those guys were both top 10 rookie draft guys. So the fact that Max is getting down into, kind of the first half of round 2, I think is pretty interesting. My pick in round 2 was pick 22. And so Matt took Winston, Sammy Coates went right in front of me, Stephon Diggs. And then I was debating between really the running backs there. The wide receivers still on the board were Devin Smith, Ty Montgomery, Rashad Green, Devontae Davis, Deontay Greenberry. Wasn't really interested there. So I was between Mike Davis and David Cobb and Javorius Allen. I went with Mike Davis. I haven't seen a lot of him play. Checked him out on Draft Breakdown the other day. And my eyes kind of don't love him. But the fact that he's got consecutive 1,300-yard seasons in the SEC and that people aren't really talking about him, that kind of feels like I don't know, Matt, like a Vic Ballard or like a Stephen Ridley type situation where just for whatever reason he's kind of going on under the radar. And, I'll be curious to see how he tests, especially as far as agility goes.
Yeah, and I'll be curious to see what his actual size is because I've on different sites it varies quite a bit. So if he actually ends up getting up in that, like close to like 215, 220 range, I think he's definitely a guy that you would, like to get, especially later in the draft with his SEC pedigree. One quick thing, a follow up on Max Williams. Before his bowl game, and he had a pretty good bowl game, scored another touchdown. Before his bowl game, this season he had a dominator rating of almost 47, which is insanely high for a tight end, especially a guy who's only 20 years old. Like that is approaching Rob Gronkowski territory. So just a little follow up there. At pick 3.7, the 31st pick, I took Tyler Lockett from Kansas State, the number 17th wide receiver overall, and I'm thrilled with that pick. At that point, it was, versus wide receivers like Justin Hardy or Philip Dorsett. Even Brett Hundley was still on the board. And even though I had Jameis Winston, I was really thinking about doubling down with him because I think he will probably have a chance to be an NFL quarterback. But in the end, Lockett was a pretty easy choice, even though I still like some of the running backs on the board. But Lockett has been so productive for 2 seasons. He's a smaller guy, only 175 pounds. But I think he will be very much like T.Y. Hilton or even John Brown in that he has, I think, the athleticism to negate any of the negative effects you would like from his size. Fantastic return man. In college, he returned collectively 6 punts and kicks for touchdowns. And this year, I think he came close to having not quite 50%, but I think 40% of his team's receiving touchdowns. So even though he's a smaller guy, he can still score touchdowns. I think he will probably end up being a 3rd or 4th round pick, which would put him in that T.Y. Hilton category. And I couldn't really pass up some of the running backs. Sorry, I couldn't pass up a guy with that upside just to take, a flyer on a running back, even though I still like some of the running backs available.
Speaking of flyers on running backs, I took with my 34th pick, Terrell Watson, running back from Azusa Pacific. Probably have never heard of him. I've got an article coming up this week on him. But basically my reason for taking him was that I was pretty confident if I didn't take him at the back of round 3 that Chad Parsons or my esteemed co-host Matt Friedman would get him in round 4. So it was kind of like a why the hell not pick. And so I picked him. Stay tuned. If you're not following me on Twitter at the CFX, I'll have the article up there in the next few days.
Yeah, really, really intriguing prospect. So at 4.07, the 43rd pick, I picked Tony Lippett, wide receiver from Michigan State. He was the 20th receiver overall. And at that point, it would have been like a running back like Marcus Coker or John Crockett, or one of the other wide receivers like Shaq Rowland or Titus Davis. But it was really easily Lippett for me. I think, he's got great height. He's around 6'3". He's kind of on the thinner side in that, he's reported being anywhere from 190 to like 195, 96 pounds. But I think he can have the athleticism that could make up for his size. He definitely has had the production this year as a wide receiver. And then on top of that, he spent a lot of time playing defensive back. And I think a guy with that kind of athleticism could end up doing pretty well in the NFL. I think he will probably be drafted in that round 3, round 4 range. And so assuming that he has the athleticism that I think he will have, I think he could have a decent chance at having a couple of seasons of, like top 30-ish success as a wide receiver. He's not going to be like a guy that is a top 10 receiver, but I think he could end up being pretty decent.
Yeah, and finally, with the 46th pick in round 4, I took Titus Davis, wide receiver from Central Michigan. Basically, I did this because I wanted to draft Corey Davis from Western Michigan, and I figured that if I couldn't do that, the next best thing was his biological brother. But in all seriousness, Titus has had a tremendous career at Michigan State. He is, as far as I can tell, the 6th receiver since the year 2000 to have 3,700 receiving yards and 37 touchdowns in his career, all while completing his college career before his 22nd birthday. So he's a guy that I kind of look at. I mean, he was the 20. Where'd this go? He was the 23rd wide receiver drafted in this, and he went 20 picks after guys who are in that kind of similar, like a little bit taller, lankier, like Aguilar, Sammy Coates, Stephon Diggs, Devin Smith, Rashad Green. He went 20 plus picks after those guys, which I thought was kind of an opportunity to make a profit there.
Yeah, I think great value there, Titus Davis.
So that concludes Matt and I's rundown of Scott Fish's DLF Expert Rookie Mock Draft, the January edition. If you are interested in learning more about that, if you check us out on Twitter at the CFX is mine or at Matt F the Oracle, we've got links up to those drafts there. You can find it in our feed. Let's go talk about the conference championship games with Jim McCormick. Please welcome back to the show Jim McCormick, who you can find on Twitter at jmccormick ESPN. He is a fantasy football contributor for ESPN.com. Jim, how are you?
I'm doing well, guys. How you guys doing?
Doing fantastic. Thank you for sharing a little bit of your evening with us. Excited to talk about conference championship weekend. So I guess just jumping right in, what caught your attention from the 2 title games this weekend?
Well, I mean, one obviously was a walloping, but the other one, I guess, is the point of contention, the NFC Championship. I mean, I don't know where to start. It's the first. Jermaine Kearse, when he caught that, he's the first player in NFL history whose only catch in a playoff game was an overtime touchdown reception. It's only the second TD in overtime of a championship game, and the first was in 1958. So that was a long time ago. It just was quite dramatic, I guess. I never saw that happening. I don't think anybody else envisioned that. Of course, Packers fans didn't envision it, but you had a quarterback who threw the most interceptions he's ever thrown in a game, and they won. I think it's the most turnovers to win a conference championship since I think the Niners did it in '81. So, I mean, it's kind of just like that was the historic element, and then I guess the blowout was historic too because it's like the second biggest blowout in AFC history and the third biggest blowout in the league history, championship round. And so we saw one incredible comeback and then we saw one incredible blowout. So it was kind of defined by these historic reference games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sticking with that first one, the Seattle Green Bay contest, Aaron Rodgers said that the Packers gave it away, while some of the Seahawks were saying, that improbable comeback showed how resilient they are. What do you think? Did Green Bay lose it, or did Seattle win it?
Well, I guess like both can exist, both things can be true. Like one team took every advantage that the Packers offered them. The Seattle took every advantage when they could, but there was also just, as everybody knows, a series of strange decisions by McCarthy that sort of led to it. I mean, win percentage, probability and all that stuff. It's realistic because it's just basing it off of past performance, I suppose. So, I mean, Seattle had a 3.9% chance of winning with 5:04, and that's using left in the game, and that's based off, I guess, ESPN's model. I didn't compare it to like advanced analytics or anything like that, but it's just the Packers were favored to win for 54 minutes of the game until they weren't.
Yeah, Jim, it was a disappointing loss for the Packers, certainly. They're now 4 years removed from that last Super Bowl appearance. What do they need to do this offseason to get back to the Super Bowl? I guess that is besides hiring a new special teams coach and having Mike McCarthy grow a play-calling backbone.
Yeah, I guess like the most obvious joke on Twitter this morning was like deflated balls for McCarthy. That was just like a layup for everybody, I suppose. But, just the lack of I guess, people complain about that, the lack of aggressiveness or whatever you want to call what happened there. But the Packers were first in total expected points on offense this season. They were ahead of, and we're talking about another historic year of offense. So it's impressive to be that special on offense in this era. But they were about 15th in total expected points added by their defense. So you're talking about a middle of the road defense. I think there's some issues with age, and like Tramon Williams is 31 and he's a free agent. Julius Peppers, for as well as he played, is 35, with 36, and it just seems like there hasn't been a ton of infusion of defensive playmakers in that system. It's clearly an element for the future, but I like their safeties that they have in Green Bay. But I would think that like they would want to start focusing on defense a little bit more in terms of their personnel investments, and then obviously like Randall Cobb. He's going to go from making, barely over $1 million this year to a $10 million receiver. So fitting all that in with the cap, I'm not a complete capologist, but it seems like that'll be a tricky balance. So it seems like their biggest goal would be to obviously maintain what is the first offense in the league while also somehow trying to invest in defense, which is like that tricky balance the league has to face. But you would think they'd want, and they had a lot of sacks this year that they were, maybe, I don't know, they were 12th or 10th in sacks. They weren't awful. They had 40 sacks, but you would think they'd want some sort of infusion of youth on that front seven and as well on outside corner.
Definitely. Transitioning to the New England Indianapolis game, I guess it was actually barely a game. Throughout the Luck and Pagano era, the Colts have steadily improved, but they've also struggled in key spots against elite teams. What do you think that the Colts need to do to continue to improve?
Well, I mean, I don't know what you guys, I mean, don't you guys, it seems like a fairly hollow roster. I know that seems like that's not completely true, that they have some talent in the secondary. But I mean, continuing to rely on Robert Mathis, who, obviously was lost for the year after the suspension. Again, like it's somewhat similar. Like they don't really have any really youth. I mean, Bjorn Werner is interesting and all, but there's really no consistency to the pass rush. And I guess in general, just the Colts seem like a team that lucked into luck. They're getting here, and it's very impressive that luck can help guide a team to this level. But it still seems somewhat to me like a hollow roster, but kind of like almost like an NBA roster that's led by like a superstar or two, but is fairly thin underwise. Like it's a top heavy roster to me, and there's not a whole lot of depth, and I think they need to continue to address that. And that seems almost like it's almost crazy because it's almost similar to how we all kind of analyzed or felt about, the Peyton Manning Colts, was that they seemed like an offensive loaded team, and also it doesn't seem like he has that many weapons. I mean, Hilton, like you said, he really wasn't successful in this game. Luck was 1 of 6, an interception targeting Hilton, and they held him to just 4 receptions and 60 yards in 2 games this year. So it seems like if you could take Hilton out, it can really affect the results. Like this idea that they had all these weapons with Nix and Wayne and the 2 tight ends, it doesn't seem like it's really coming to fruition when the results matter. So I'd be completely happy if I was a Colts fan because I'd had Andrew Luck, but I would also wonder if you had the real elements of a full football team to contribute. I mean, I think they're almost missing 2 phases overall.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you made that Peyton Manning Colts comparison, because that was actually something that I said last week on the show that, if you took the quarterback names out of it, that our guest was basically describing that same thing. And, I think looking at it really going into that game, the Patriots are kind of known for, we're going to stop the one thing that you do best and see if you can beat us with your plan B. And it's like, if you look at it, what is their plan B? An aging Reggie Wayne, an injury downtrodden Hakeem Nicks, an undrafted running back.
Boom Heron, right?
Yeah, what's the plan B for the Colts offense? And I don't know. But kind of switching gears to the team that beat the crap out of them, the Patriots. They're now going to their 6th Super Bowl in 14 years. And despite having Brady and Belichick throughout that time, the identity and style of the team is always changing. How do you think that this Patriots team compares to some of the previous Patriots teams that have reached the Super Bowl?
It's kind of more reminiscent, with better offense, I guess. But in terms of the balance, it's more reminiscent of the earlier era, the 02, 03, 04, those teams that made the runs. Particularly the mid, the 04, 05 team, whatever, that beat my Eagles. That was enjoyable. But I guess it seems more balanced in that sense. I mean, Chandler Jones is really dynamic, and the way they use Jamie Collins, and just like you said, the way that the coaching staff, obviously spearheaded by Belichick, but how they're able to isolate not just teams' weaknesses, but isolate their strengths and almost force teams to be one-dimensional. Andrew Luck was pressured on 47% of his dropbacks. That's the highest single pressure rate of his career, and so they were able to really offset what they did the best. And I guess Revis is a priority, but it's probably one of the better teams I've seen in terms of the balance that they've had. As in terms of how many ways they can hit you. Obviously, Gronk is a huge element, but he's healthy and he's producing. And it'll be really interesting to see how they match up, because on the outside isn't where they really kind of hurt you. They can hurt you, but it'll be interesting to see how this Seattle secondary and this hyped matchup between this amazing defense and this highly efficient offense, how that'll work out. But I would put it up there with one of the better Patriots teams, and that's why this is one of the closest spreads in Super Bowl history.
Hey, Jim, a quick follow-up on that. One of the areas you mentioned, the Seattle secondary, one of the areas where they're actually fairly vulnerable is against the tight end position, specifically in allowing touchdowns to tight ends. I'm wondering if you think that will be a really important matchup in this game.
It certainly it could. It's obviously, yeah. If their allowance is in that sense, they're allowing touchdowns and they might be soft on the inside, where the tight ends are lining up. But obviously, this is a little bit more unique in terms of the number one weapon is the tight end. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't gone through enough tape to say what the result of that. Those numbers are in terms of their allowance, but I would probably assume that they're not keying in on opposing tight ends nearly as much as they will on Gronk. And so in a single game, it's hard to say how much that plays out, but I'm sure that it might be one of the things where they're going to almost force the outside guys, LaFell and Edelman to beat them on the outside. And it'd be interesting to see like who ends up lining up there, because, Cam Chancellor is an excellent cover guy, and Earl Thomas, ends up being kind of hit or miss in terms of, he's almost Iversonian in terms of the way he kind of jumps lanes a little bit sometimes, like a little bit of risk reward kind of player. So Asante Samuel, if you will. So it'll be interesting how that works out. But I don't think they're going to go into the game forgetting who they're facing. So it'll be interesting.
I just want to point out the use of the word Iversonian. I think that might be the first time it's ever been said, and I just am excited it happened on Rotoviz Radio.
Right, and I was going to say that was actually very Philadelphian to use the word Iversonian.
There you go.
So we are talking with Jim McCormick, who you can find on Twitter at JMcCormick, ESPN. So we talked a little while ago about the Super Bowl matchup, and you mentioned the line being close. Most books currently have it, relatively low spread and a total of about 48.5.
Right.
What's your kind of off the cuff reaction, looking ahead to the Super Bowl, of how these teams, how this game might shake out?
Well, I mean, these are two top teams. This isn't like this model that we've like kind of heard from the NFL in the parity push, like where we have wild cards and fourth seeds and fifth seeds. This is the first time in 30 years the top seed in each conference has reached the Super Bowl in consecutive years. That was 1983. I was born. I'm not sure if you guys were born, but that's a long time ago. It's 30 years ago that two top teams met. So that's why I think it's interesting, where you don't see this mismatch, or there's no surprise. There's not really a surprise here in terms of this matchup. I went back and looked at Pro Football Reference, and the closest spreads of all time were 81, which was like the Niners, which that same season, the Niners had 6 turnovers to get into that game. So it's almost similar in that sense. And the Niners played the Bengals, and the Niners were -1 in 81. And then the undefeated Dolphins were -1 against the Redskins in 72. So we're going like back into history to see a matchup this close. So Vegas really just wants the public to load up on who their favorite is. It's essentially a pick 'em, it seems like. And I wouldn't be surprised, actually, if most books have it at 1 or a pick, but by the time it comes out. The over-under is probably just, obviously a function of, we have one really good pass rush on the Pat side. I mean, I guess they both have talent at that, but 2 really good secondaries, and you would just imagine some heavy scheming on both sides. So it is kind of low of an over-under for 2 teams, especially with the Patriots and their ability to score, but it's going to be really interesting. And I guess the line speaks to how close the game should be.
Yeah, and speaking of the line, I think it opened yesterday at 3, and very interestingly, so far about 70+% of people are on the Patriots, in reaction to that early line of them being a 3-point underdog. So just kind of an interesting there. I'm always a little suspect of when too much of the public gets on one side of a game. But anyways, Matt, did you have something?
Yeah, so Jim, just kind of switching gears a little bit, when we had been emailing back and forth earlier, you mentioned this last week that you were at the Fantasy Sports Trade Association Winter Conference. Can you tell us exactly what the trade association does, and what were some of the topics covered at the conference?
Sure. I mean, well, they're the trade association, so they're advocates for growth in the industry and doing the right way, in the sense of there's like some cohesion among all the member companies who have great interest in seeing the industry grow. And that there's some sort of, a time for us to meet. We meet, it's twice a year. It's usually, in the winter. It's usually like late January and then mid-June. It's also obviously a chance just to meet everybody and hang out. But in terms of the business sense, the conference focuses on the topics that are most pertinent to growing the business and what might be next. Because there's quite the marriage between, obviously like technology and marketing, and and so obviously the biggest growth factor in the industry, as we all know, is DFS, daily fantasy. And so a lot of the conference, actually the panels were focused, at least early in the conference, like in terms of establishing the whole premise of the conference was basically, ensuring the legality and the legitimacy of the DFS side continues to grow. What was really interesting was focusing on how lobbying and companies doing it the right way, and like framing daily fantasy in the right way, and avoiding the languaging and kind of the framing of this business in a way that could be costly. You don't want to associate it with what essentially led to Black Friday in the poker sense. So you want to keep the DFS side growing, because there might seem to be some kind of perception that there's like a disconnect between the redraft side of business and the DFS side of business, but that's starting to merge. And whatever kind of hesitancy was on one side, or whatever kind of resentment there might be, it sounds crazy to say, but what I mean by that is like there's a new game in town, and you need to recognize it, and it's a growing real faction, and really more importantly, it's a way for more people to get engaged with our industry in terms of we like to talk about imaginary sports, and it's fun, and we should all continue to do it. But I guess most importantly, it's about like all of us like continuing to grow the industry and do it the right way. So it's DFS was basically the main theme, outside of all the normal things, which are basically apps and technology and growing and the normal industry trends demographic wise, like learning about the industry. But mostly DFS was probably the biggest new implement in terms of just how much it was dominating the landscape of our conversation.
Maybe your sports are imaginary, Jim, but mine are real.
There you go. But like
just like his girlfriend.
Hey,
there you go.
So in real football news, outside the fantasy world, the Broncos recently hired Gary Kubiak. The Falcons hired Kyle Shanahan. Do you have any thoughts on these hirings?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, I guess it kind of fits what the Falcons like. I mean, the Browns, are like a 3.5, 3.6 yards per carry team. And Shanahan was able to, like in general, was able to produce a pretty healthy like YPA. And I don't know, I kind of actually like Kyle Shanahan for this fit. I think it's better than the conservative measures that Mike Smith employed. I mean, at least there was some flexibility in how Shanahan will deploy his talent. I guess it's a real referendum year, I guess, for Matt Ryan and these guys in this offense to truly sustain, because it seems like they're really a very inside-outside, literally, offense. And that has worked for Drew Brees for a long time, but Drew Brees also is really good on the road. It's like the drop-off is just relative. Whereas like it seems to be a real drop-off where you're going into Minnesota and getting kicked around, by a team that you shouldn't be getting kicked around by in that sense, rookie in his second start. So it seems like Kyle Shanahan will help. Kubiak with his own blocking scheme, it's interesting, but it seems like the demands of the Kubiak system, like they asked the quarterback to throw on the run a little bit. It seems to be like there's stretch run plays, and that all seems fine for their personnel in the running game. But all the bootlegs and stuff, it'll be interesting to see how that applies to Peyton Manning. Of course, they're not going to ask Peyton Manning to run around, but in this one last year, it'll be interesting how much more. It'd be interesting to see if Peyton Manning was really in a run-first offense. That would be interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even to that, I think they have no tight ends on the roster under contract for next year. So, like, what does that mean, especially given his history with that position? Right. So, yeah, kind of a curious move there with Gary Kubiak. You wonder if that signals they're bringing back Julius or moving on. I don't really know.
Or has Owen Daniels already got the text message?
Owen Daniels is on the take. So, moving on, just one last question, Jim. This has been a lot of fun. The Pro Bowl is this weekend. Is there any reason we should watch this game?
Probably not. I mean, I guess, to watch NFL players have fun, I guess that makes no sense. I mean, like it's honestly, I love football, and I'm not even drawn to the game. don't know what to say. I mean, maybe is there DFS for that game? Because if so, like then maybe that makes it fun. Like if I can bet on like the on Odell Beckham having on his own, if I can invest in it, maybe it's fun. But other than that, it seems like a waste of everybody's time, and I think that's been the case for a long time.
Yeah, there's just went over to DraftKings. There are no NFL games on the board right now, so that makes me think that.
Man, see what I mean? Like, so that's our business venture is Pro Bowl DFS. It's a one day, literally a 1 day site.
All right. Good stuff, Jim. Thank you so much for your time. We will be in touch.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Rotoviz Radio. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast through your favorite directory. Also, if you're on iTunes, please stop by and leave a rating and review to let us know how we're doing. Looking ahead to next week's episode, we've got Evan Silva on to preview the Super Bowl. You won't want to miss that. It's going to be a great session. We will catch you next week.